Hello! Today I'm taking a look at Advent Children, a 2005 movie by Square Enix, created as a follow-up sequel to their 1997 video game, Final Fantasy VII. Now, since I recently discussed Kazushige Najima's Final Fantasy VII novel, On the Way to a Smile, it seemed as good a time as any to really delve back into Final Fantasy VII lore, and for the first time in several years, I sat down and watched Advent Children. And it was an interesting experience, firstly because it's been so long since I last saw it. I was surprised to see how my opinions and my memories of the film measured up against the reality of it. But also, for the first time, I watched Advent Children, the complete edition, rather than the standard DVD edition I bought back in 2006. And the complete edition is essentially a director's cut that adds an extra 25 minutes or so to the runtime. And as I'll discuss over the course of this episode, while some of that additional footage was superfluous effects and stuff, for the most part it really made the film much more comprehensible, insofar as that was required. And I'll touch on this shortly. So, kicking off, and as I mentioned in my previous episode, everything concerning sequel content, including Advent Children, On the Way to a Smile, and so on, was questionably received by some Final Fantasy VII fans, and particularly those that liked the ambiguity of the original ending, and that bittersweet conclusiveness of seeing Red 13 looking out of the ruins of the once lively Midgar. There were some that were satisfied with that ending. There were some that felt more Final Fantasy VII would be great in theory, but they couldn't really see how a sequel, or even possibly a prequel, could live up to the standards of the original game. And on the flip side, there were those that were totally up for revisiting the world of Final Fantasy VII, and the prospect of seeing Cloud, Barret, Tifa, and our heroes in what at the time was cutting-edge CGI in 2005 was a really exciting prospect. And just to contextualise that, looking back to the time at this point, I think the highest quality of graphics we'd really seen our Final Fantasy VII heroes in was the 1998 fighting game Urgites and 2002's Kingdom Hearts, with the latter I think also being the first time we saw Cloud, Aerith, Sephiroth and co given voice actors and certain characteristics that really augmented them and modernised them compared to the original 1997 game. So Advent Children was a big deal at the time of release, and although I get that some disliked it on principle, personally I think a lot was done to remove it from any direct and overtly negative comparisons to Final Fantasy VII proper. For example, the decision to make it a movie rather than a video game, which was something that had been considered early on, was a good move, I think. The decision to set it 2 years after Meteorfall was also a good move, because we have it removed from the original by both the media delivery, but also the chronology of the storyline as well. And a decision was also made to have quite a thin story for Advent Children, with ambiguous or interpretable character arcs. And this went some way to prevent any definitive change in direction or conclusions for our heroes being drawn following the first game. And while the lack of story or character development was criticised by some, which I'll come to shortly, I think appreciating the film for what it is, which is ultimately bringing our Final Fantasy VII heroes into the 21st century with some visually stunning scenarios, the story was always likely to be a secondary factor that simply propelled things along and facilitated the need for cool action sequences and Cloud running around with a Buster Sword on his motorcycle and stuff. And where I've previously described Advent Children as a feature-length tech demo, someone also commented recently on the channel that they enjoy Advent Children as a Final Fantasy VII themed showpiece. And I agree with that perspective and that sentiment, and there was never a need, or indeed arguably the ability, to tell a complex, involved Final Fantasy VII story cinematically that could have lived up to the standards of the complexities of the original game and all of the subplots and character arcs that were able to be delivered there, because of course the medium of games permitted 30 plus hours of kind of narrative experience. So with that in mind, as we delve into the film proper, I think it's firstly worth looking at the narrative the structure and the pace of the movie, as well as the central cast. Because another, if not criticism of the film, then at least recurring observation that's kind of perpetuated across message boards and forums over the years, is how relatively little it features the secondary heroes of Final Fantasy VII. And for me personally, for example, thinking back to 2006, Cid Highwind was one of my favourite heroes in Final Fantasy VII. And so I was a bit gutted when I first watched the movie to find that Cid has about a minute or two of screen time, along with Barrett, Nanaki, and so on, while new characters, such as Denzel, were given a comparatively good chunk of story and screen time. But looking at it today more objectively and beyond my initial fanboying of wanting to see my favourite characters on screen, I can see how it was necessary for the success and the succinctness of the film that only a handful of characters be utilised to deliver on the core story. Now, this may sound elementary, but if we look at the track record for video game movie adaptations, and particularly adaptations that draw on large game casts, such as Jean-Claude Van Damme's 1994 Street Fighter movie, we can see how things quickly unravel when trying to nod to all the different facets of the game, the lore, and giving everyone's favourite character screen time. And while Street Fighter has since become one of those cult movies where it's so bad it's sort of good, the reality is that the coherence of that film was undermined by trying to give equal prominence to a 20-strong cast. And I read a critique of the movie a few years ago that worked out that each character's dedicated screen time for personal story averaged out at about 40 seconds, which is evidently no room for growth or character development. So, turning to Advent Children, there was clearly a benefit in prioritising a smaller cast that formed the nucleus of the story, the atmosphere, the themes, and the narrative progression. So firstly, we have our hero Cloud, who straddles a personal story and a macro story. And beneath that, we have Tifa, who facilitates and drives forward the arc of Cloud's personal story. And we have Rufus and the Turks, who facilitate and push forward the arc of the macro story. We also have Denzel introduced, who serves the dual purpose of contextualising the circumstances of Geostigma, and also the bad guy's evil plans, because of course he's a victim that requires rescuing by Cloud later as well. So Denzel's entire inclusion is really good for the world building and the idea of Edge City and Geostigma and that sort of thing. And finally we have our antagonists Loz, Yazoo, and of course Kadaj, who propel events and obstacles forward through their villainy. So through this handful of prominent characters, the story is delivered, and while the screenwriting, such as it is muddlingly ambiguous at times, the story doesn't overcomplicate itself by trying to establish loads of legacy content and legacy characters, such as Cid, Yuffie, and so on. And indeed, as I think back over the events of the film, probably the only scene that could be considered as irrelevant or derivative was actually the Bahamut battle. And I'm not saying I disliked it, because of course it's a great action sequence, but the entire purpose of that scene, the only reason it exists really, was to showcase the secondary heroes and the party of Final Fantasy VII come back together. It brings everyone back in a cool action sequence. And I suppose, yes, arguably, we could say it contributes to Cloud's personal arc, and Tifa trying to encourage him that he has friends he can reach out to and so on. But the payoff with Bahamut and the Bahamut battle, arguably, I think you could cut that sequence from the film, and it would still make sense. So, moving on and taking a look at the characters that they prioritised and the themes of the film, it was interesting to see where Square opted to take the story, because while they opted to keep things interpretable, it's clear that in the wake of Final Fantasy VII proper, there was no happy ever after for our heroes, and quite to the contrary, there is a bleakness and a desperation that permeates our heroes, along with the population of Midgar. Now, Tetsuya Nomura has stated that he feels the film is about survival, and that can certainly be seen in some respects, such as Cloud and Tifa grappling with the past and those that they lost on their journey. It can also be seen in Rufus and the Turks, who have come to terms with an event that they've lived through, but in their own way have lost something because they're no longer on top. The Shinra is no longer the dominant political, economic force in the world. And even looking at the inclusion of Kadaj, we could see him as a sort of a perpetuation of the survival of Genova and some semblance of Sephiroth. So I can certainly see how survival is a potential theme and quite a big factor in this film. But for me, I felt the overriding theme of the film was more to do with atonement, because while all the aforementioned characters have survived, they've done so at a great personal cost, and we find most of them in Advent Children in a state of reflective remorse. The first scene is of Cloud memorialising Zack by planting the Buster Sword on the outskirts of Midgar, which is a nod towards this guilt that has hung over from Final Fantasy VII proper. The fact that he spends the majority of this film alone, and also utilising the motif of the lone wolf on his shoulder pauldron, and of course, this is accompanied by recurring visions of a wolf alongside him, it shows that Cloud has entered a sort of personal purgatory, and he's at a loss with how to redeem himself. In similar fashion, Rufus openly laments Shinra's role in destroying the planet when trying to recruit Cloud, and even Reno, who is most often presented as a brazen upstart, he has a scene in the complete edition of Advent Children where he reflects to Rude, the world was almost obliterated and we were the obliterators, which frames him and the Turks as much more considerate and humane characters in the wake of Meteorfall, and also the fact that he too has a lingering sense of guilt for actions he committed in the past. And perhaps the most conspicuous absence in the film, and a character who I think is responsible for much of the unspoken emotional disarray among Final Fantasy VII's heroes, and particularly Cloud and Tifa, is of course Aerith, and there are several intervals where she influences events and Cloud interacts with her in an attempt to come to terms with this survivor's guilt. And as we see in the final church scene of the film, the rest of the party seem to be equally memorialising Aerith because we see them wearing pink ribbons on their arms. So I think she's a huge contributing factor, albeit an unseen one, to the telling and the circumstances of this story. And if we try and read between the lines with all this dilly-dally, shilly-shally nonsense, what we have is a group of people coming to terms with the loss of a friend, and using a variety of coping mechanisms to do so. Turning to additional themes, we also have prominence offered to newer and younger characters, such as Denzel, Marlene, Kadaj, along with the Geostigma children of Edge and Midgar. And if we consider the title Advent Children, this is clearly an important aspect of the film. It is the advent of a moment, which I think we can assume is the Genova reunion, and of course the children are a driving factor of that. And this passing of the torch, or generational bridging of old and new, is clearly something that runs in the subtext of the movie. And on that note, just segueing off, I've always wondered whether they'll wrap Final Fantasy VII up with some sort of definitive conclusion, because Advent Children serves as both an epilogue to the main game, but also the start of something new as well. But then, of course, the series sort of meanders off until Dirge of Cerberus takes place. And the final canonical moment of Final Fantasy VII, I think, is seeing that Genesis is alive. So I've no idea how or if that will conclude. It feels quite possible that the Final Fantasy VII remake is simultaneously incorporating, restructuring and sequelizing all of these events. So it's entirely possible that Advent Children and everything included there will be adapted or retconned or at least hopefully concluded over the next few years. Now, turning to the characters and starting first I think with Kadaj and the Remnants, because they are the main disruptors and influencers of the story. From the outset, these guys were juvenile facsimiles of Sephiroth, and I think every fan, upon first seeing them, could see the aesthetic connection there. And as always, there were some that disliked them, and some that did like them. And for my part, I've definitely warmed to them over time, because much like my early impressions of characters like Yuffie or Selphie, which I've discussed in the past, I don't immediately take to overtly juvenile personalities in games, and particularly in Japanese games, where they always have a very obvious and augmented immaturity to their dialogue. However, in many cases, and particularly with the aforementioned Yuffie, Selphie, and also Kadaj, it's a very conscious decision by the writers to make them seem immature. And for Yuffie's part, she's designed to sort of annoy the player or kind of amuse the player, depending on how you look at her. But also, she is designed to be annoying to Cloud and his friends as well. So it's not a poorly written character, it's a conscious effort to make her juvenile. And for Kadaj's part, his juvenile nature makes him all the more vindictive. And there's something in the young and not having this lived experience that comes through in Kadaj. It's like he's not mature enough to have a moral compass that makes him all the more villainous and sort of potentially lethal and threatening. And I think that comes across in Kadaj very well, and his lack of understanding of the world beyond his base instinctive purpose to forge the reunion shines through in several scenarios, and particularly in his conversations with Rufus. And these interactions really grew on me, and I grew to kind of quite like Kadaj. So the glimpses of Kadaj that we see in the film do enough to propel the story forward, and once again, the complete edition is marginally better at explaining him and his origins and his intentions, but much the same way On the Way to a Smile gives context to the circumstances of our heroes in Advent Children. It is Najima's other companion novel, The Kids Are All Right, that gives more understanding to Kadaj and his emergence, and it does make him a bit more interesting, and it explains his range of powers and these similarities he's inherited from Genova a bit more clearly than Advent Children, the proper movie, does. But that aside, and as I say, he did grow on me in this film, and particularly following his final battle with Cloud, there's a much more sympathetic and understandable aspect to his character when we realise that he's been puppeteered by the malevolent force of Sephiroth. And the kind of penny drops that he's so similar to Cloud and how Cloud is in the original game. So in his final moments, he's suddenly very relatable, and Aerith offering him her hand as an act of redemption is quite a touching end to Kadaj's sort of short stint as a villain. And finally, just a note on Loz and Yazoo. They are intended to represent other aspects of Sephiroth's personality, but they are evidently less significant and more like henchmen for Kadaj, who simply help him do the menial stuff like rounding up the children and searching for Genova and that sort of thing. Although I will say, for his part, Loz does have a rather epic fight with Tifa in the church, and I think that's probably one of the best scenes in this movie. So, moving on and looking at our legacy characters who appear in Advent Children, I think it's worthwhile to touch on the Turks and Rufus here, who, of all of the cast, were probably the most developed and different compared to their appearance in the original game. And I have got 2 episodes on the channel dedicated to discussing the Turks and Rufus, where I touch on Advent Children. But just to consider them broadly in the context of the film, this was the first time we'd seen them since the 1997 game, and certainly it's the first time we'd seen them elevated in the hierarchy of Final Fantasy characters to something that approached a central cast and a central component of the story. Now, on the back of my comments about the Final Fantasy VII party not being featured much, some might have questioned why they chose to feature the Turks so prominently, and particularly as protagonistic allies rather than villains. And indeed, on top of that, why did they go to such lengths to resurrect and explain away Rufus's demise in Final Fantasy VII proper, when perhaps they could have just shown an alternate perspective from Barrett or Cid or one of those plausibly secondary leader type characters from the first game. And despite thinking this early on, I think featuring Shinra really does work here, because they were such a prominent and domineering feature of Final Fantasy VII's world. It's really important to see how far they've fallen and where they're at as well, by the time Advent Children rolls around. So that was quite interesting, but also I think it added much more plausibility to them being the ones who are seeking out Genova. And for example, looking at these secondary heroes, such as Barrett, such as Cid, it makes much less sense for them to be pursuing that sort of thing, and having dialogues with Kadaj, it simply wouldn't work the same way. Rufus being this mistrustful catalyst between Cloud and Kadaj is perfectly placed and perfectly plausible in the context of these characters and the game events, the story events, to propel that plot forward and add plausible exposition to both of them. And I think going further than this, Rufus was actually essential to the storytelling in Advent Children. And while I have questioned his miraculous survival in the past, I do let it slide because no other character is as well placed to do what he does in this film. And crucially, they do retain everything that made him great in the original game, which is his calm and implacable demeanour. This very calculating personality and his willingness to take control and put himself in harm's way, even though he could reasonably delegate this to others. And again, I covered this at length in my Rufus episode, but suffice to say, I think over time I've grown to appreciate what an important and an interesting component of Advent Children that he actually was. Now, moving on to the Turks, much like Kadaj having his brothers do the grunt work, the relationship between Rufus and the Turks is very much the same as the original game, and indeed, quite possibly the only thing retained from Shinra's pre-apocalypse days is the hierarchy and the status of the Turks and their loyalty to Rufus. So, a point of contention among Final Fantasy VII fans, or some of them at least, was how the Turks, and particularly Reno and Rude, were presented as much more jovial, slapstick characters in this movie, and it ran contrary to the cold-blooded ruthlessness that they exhibit in the 1997 game. And some of the responses I got to my Turks episode were quite interesting regarding this, because while some people agreed that yes, Reno and Rude had lost that menacing amoral edge that made them so interesting, others contended that in the 2 years since Meteorfall, where the Turks have witnessed the destruction that they helped kind of create, they've undergone some personal change and character development, which is kind of plausible to have occurred when you're approaching an extinction event of Meteorfall proportions. And I do get that, and as I say, in the director's cut of Advent Children, we see Reno remark on their role in the planet's demise. But that's still at odds with the slapstick dynamic where, for example, we see a road sign falling on Rude's head, or Reno accidentally steps on Rude's sunglasses, so Rude's able to subtly produce another pair from his jacket pocket, and this sort of stuff. And so that's kind of slapstick, and it's not to do with their character arc, it's to do with visual comedy. And I'm not sure where I stand on this, because whenever I watch Advent Children, I do find them quite funny, and they look great, and they're in some great scenes. But whenever I play the original game, I'm likewise really wedded to them being these kind of ruthless upstarts who admittedly do have some comedic reprieves in the game, such as discussing the girls that they like, or declining to fight Cloud when they're on vacation. But that's much more dialogue-driven, cynical comedy that doesn't detract from their villainy, rather than the overtly visual slapstick stuff that we see in Advent Children. So, again, just an observation. I guess that's down to personal opinion as to how you kind of perceive them and which version of the Turks you kind of prefer. But while considering these contrasting versions of the Turks, it is interesting to look at Final Fantasy VII Remake, because they seem to have retained their earlier villainous version of the Turks in this game, which is great, but also they do feature much more, and I have a feeling that Square are trying to strike this middle ground, because obviously the Turks are very popular. They were prominently featured in Advent Children, and I think this will follow through to the remake game. But also I think we'll see them develop potentially a more amicable and comedic approach too. And we may even see them sort of team up with Cloud in this story. Who knows? So that's a look at some characters that I think really propel the story forward. And you'll note I haven't discussed Cloud in any depth, because really through this entire film, his very muted, husker-like disposition prevents much development from taking place. And he's propelled along mainly by his demons and some investigative hints offered by Rufus and Vincent, rather than any heroic personal drive. And owing to the themes I mentioned earlier, I think atonement and the other side of that, which is regret, is very much the motive behind Cloud's appearance and his kind of mutedness in Advent Children. And perhaps because of this, many have criticised the film, and noted that of all of Cloud's appearances across various media, from Kingdom Hearts to Dissidia and so on, Advent Children is his most subdued and depressive rendition to date. And while, yes, of course, in Final Fantasy VII proper, he has numerous issues, there's always that scope for comedy and absurdity and the let's mosey aspect of Cloud, which is strangely absent in the film. And I think the personal ambiguity around Cloud was to try and prevent any definitive direction for their characters or conclusions for their characters in what was a highly experimental cinematic endeavour. So, moving on, the film progresses through various fight scenes and dialogues as Cloud unravels the mysteries of Geostigma and the villainous remnants. And the movie ultimately arrives at two payoffs. The first being the Bahamut battle that we mentioned earlier, which is where our heroes reunite. And finally, the climactic Sephiroth reveal, which had been teased from the outset by the silver-haired aesthetics of Kadaj. And much like the original game, and unlike the remake, the Sephiroth appearance in Advent Children is very contained and controlled. It's not too overstated. And so he retains his mystique and this badassery when he finally confronts Cloud. And indeed, I think he has about 3 bits of dialogue in the film. And once again, this was just perfect for what the audience wanted and what we could reasonably expect from a sequel movie that didn't want to overly disrupt the character arcs and the prestige and the legacy, I suppose, of the original game. And not to labour too much on the climactic fight scene, because I think it speaks for itself, I think the heavy metal rendition of One Winged Angel playing as Cloud's jumping about and falling debris and stuff is the perfect way to finish off the film. And arguably, I think, what it had been building towards all along. It's very thematically appropriate as Cloud comes to terms with his past. He would literally confront the antagonist of his past in what was, at the time, and still I think it holds up today, a very cutting-edge, visually striking action sequence that brings Advent Children to a relatively self-contained close. Now, before wrapping up and having mentioned One Winged Angel, I think Uematsu and the sound team did a great job of revitalising key scores from Final Fantasy VII, which more broadly had been explored prior to Advent Children, with piano collections being released and the Black Mages rock band releasing albums and so on. But beyond the reimagined OST, there were some great original pieces of music in Advent Children, such as Black Water, which is this slow melodic metal track which we hear as Kadaj entices children into the pool of water, and my personal favourite, a piece of music called For the Reunion, which is a piano piece playing during a early altercation between Kadaj and Rufus. So I felt the overall aesthetic of Advent Children, from its excellent CGI and cinematography through to its audio and sound design, was really good, and crafted its rather bleak and despondent mood brilliantly. And again, for a movie that was the first really up-to-date, cutting-edge visual we'd had of our Final Fantasy VII heroes, with voice acting and the full package, I think it certainly succeeded on that front. And another thing I haven't really delved into, but I know is a source of interest for a lot of fans, is voice acting and the cast selected, for various characters in various games. And while at this point in time we had already seen Final Fantasy X, which was the real icebreaker for voice acting in Final Fantasy games, it was very interesting to see where they'd go with the voice cast. And personally, I think it was very well cast, particularly Cloud, Tifa and Sephiroth, who are those key characters that you really want to be delivered appropriately through both visuals but also their voices. So, just to wrap up, as time has worn on and we look back at Advent Children, it does seem a curious footnote in the chronology and the legacy of Final Fantasy VII, which, along with Dirge of Cerberus and later content, have extended the grand narrative to new and as of yet unresolved degrees. Novels and supplementary media continue to be released to augment the gaps between these milestone pieces, such as On the Way to a Smile, as I've discussed, The Kids Are Alright, and as someone commented to me the other day, The Maiden Who Travels the Planet, which is a novel that I hadn't actually heard of before. But it shows that beyond Kazushige Najima, there are other authors who are starting to become involved and extend the universe of the franchise. So it doesn't feel too dissimilar from what they did with the Star Wars saga and the myriad of books that were later released for that. But looking to Advent Children itself, I think it does retain these tech demo vibes, and it was primed in the mid-2000s to excite audiences for the myriad of compilation material that would be released, across the rest of that decade. And personally, I enjoy the film on these terms, and while it never achieved, and it probably didn't set out to achieve, acclaim that was, on the level of the original game, it was a visual and technical masterpiece that faithfully translated our Final Fantasy heroes to the graphics and voice-acted expectations of the 21st century. So there we have it. If you got this far, thanks very much for listening. And if you enjoyed the episode, please consider subscribing and checking out my other episodes. And feel free to drop a comment below. Let me know your thoughts on Advent Children.